When it comes to the deadliest peacetime maritime disaster in history, you might expect a steamer to be too innocuous to make the top 10 list. Yet the upgrade from then humble steamboat saw the loss of enough crew and passengers to match it with that of the Titanic. Except this was some decades later when, in 1949, 1,500 people perished when the Taiping steamers collided with another vessel. So what went wrong? Who were the passengers? And was anyone punished for this catastrophic collision? To answer those questions, we will need to revisit China at the turn of the last century. Civil War. The split of the Chinese nation saw two sides competing for the future of their country: the Kuomintang-led government of the Republic of China and the forces of the Chinese Communist Party. In what was a long and complex and painful war, the conclusion was, in short, the communist dominance in the mainland China, with the republic holding off on the little island of Taiwan. The dispute has never been officially resolved. A peace treaty has never been signed, nor an armistice established. Instead, a tactical ceasefire remains the closest thing to any formal agreement between the two armies. This backdrop sets the stage for the Taiping, as scores of Chinese people were fleeing their war-torn hometowns, hoping for a new life after the Civil War. They wanted to escape the newly established Communist Party by seeking refuge in Taiwan, and so it was that a steamer was bound to transport these hopefuls. A steamer is a vessel that relies on steam-powered pedals to travel at a steady pace. It might be typical to envision them on rivers, but in fact, steamers can be ocean-faring, often seaworthy, which would imply they have sturdy shapes well-suited for waves, mostly used for trade and ferrying people. And the Taiping was no different. This was not some ramshackle dinghy, but a strong boat engineered to withstand the power of big waves and fierce currents. In fact, it had made the route between China and Taiwan many times, so it can't be said the disaster was caused by an inexperienced crew or uncharted territory. More so, the ocean dividing the two lands does not have a reputation for rough seas. But at over 700 kilometers to travel there are plenty of opportunities to go wrong. One thing that went wrong was the timing. Unlike previous trips, there was one big difference this time around. It was happening in the dark. But that's just the start of the problems. Next up was the capacity. Records show that the boat was overcrowded, having taken on board double its capacity at 1,500 people on board, a full 1,000 higher than the 508 voyage tickets sold. So desperate were Chinese immigrants to escape that they could not wait for a later boat for fear that they might not have another chance. And with 2 million mainlanders leaving the country, most bound for Taiwan, there was a sense that options would be running out if people didn't seize the first opportunity that presented itself. And who can blame them, given the East China Sea was their only obstacle to a new life? Most of the sea is shallow, with almost 3/4 of the vast water terrain being less than 200 meters deep. The average depth is 350, which certainly dwarfs any human, but the shallowness plus the wind buffering from islands and peninsulas tends to create far more gentle sailing conditions than, say, the Atlantic Ocean. When you add that Taiwan is roughly 100 miles from the mainland, making it possible on clear days to see the neighboring land, it makes the journey all the more tempting, especially when you are desperate. So it was that day before the festival Chinese New Year's Eve, on a chilly morning just after midnight, the Taiping sent out for the last time, on waters it knew well but in conditions that were unfamiliar. A curfew against sailing after 6 p.m. meant that boats had to travel without lights to avoid detection, so now the Taiping was making the long sea journey blind. Tools like radar and radio would not be what they are too, and certainly not available on vessels such as this. This means for the hours the boat was out in the ocean, everyone was in the dark with no idea what was in front of them. It would be easy to think that an ocean that big, and at an hour this early, the chance of running head-on with another vessel was zero. Perhaps this only made the crew more complacent. Perhaps they felt they knew the route like the back of their hands. But what they couldn't have known was that somewhere out there in the dark was another boat. A strong boat, because if they had known, they probably wouldn't have been going full steam ahead. Bang! the Taiping collides with the Shenyang cargo ship near the Zhaosan archipelago. The number of survivors is tiny. In fact, the boat sank so quickly that most of the 1,500 people on board didn't have a chance to know what the noise was before the cold water flooded their rooms. The boat tipped downward almost immediately, and screams were soon silenced by the water, leaving bubbling oil in the wake of the sunken vessel. Wang Shuliang tells the story of her older brother, Wang Kaofu, who was last seen aboard the Taiping. He had been watching some friends play poker by lantern light below deck when he went to investigate the commotion. He was never seen again. His parents even went to their graves believing their son had made it safely across. The cargo ship also sustained fatal damage. Of the 75 people on board, only 3 were rescued from the waters. If you didn't drown, you froze. Accounts differ as to whether it was passing Australian or US warships that came to the rescue, but there is no official word of assistance from China, Japan, or Korea. This is not to say that this is due to border disputes, or rather exclusive economic zones, the areas of the sea that sovereign states have special rights regarding the explosion and use of marine resources. But it's not hard to imagine that a diplomatic quagmire could have impeded possible search and rescue operations. Or most likely, all those decades ago, the nations did not have the resources or intent to be that far out, let alone at that hour. In any case, would it have made a difference? Most likely not. Because though the lives of 35 people were saved, just over 2% of the passengers that took the fateful trip to a new life, most bodies were not recovered. Whether they drifted out into the ocean or were dragged down by the force with the sinking ship can't be known, but given how quickly the Taiping went underwater, it would be reasonable to conclude that no one would have been able to do anything even if they had been there. The Taiping is often compared to the Mayflower for her role in bringing Chinese immigrants to Taiwan, but now is compared to the Titanic, another steamer that suffered a similar number of fatalities. According to survivors and families of the bereaved, victims included military officers, representatives of the National Assembly, and even a former provincial chairman. Though conspiracy theories are not plentiful when it comes to the sinking of the Taiping, this might say more about Chinese censorship than it does about Chinese subterfuge. In any case, it is recognized as an accident and remembered as such with a monument within the perimeter of a naval base. Access is restricted, but victims' families hope that the memorial can be moved to a public face so that everyone can learn about the tragedy. In popular culture, a film based on the event was released in 2014. The 2-part films were directed by Hong Kong cinema heavyweight John Woo, with the first installment setting up the characters and backdrop, and the final concluding installment chronicling 3 couples' escape from the Chinese Revolution. Comparisons to Hollywood's Titanic may be a touch too cynical and patronizing for some, yet both use dramatic license to tell the true story. After all, eyewitness accounts are incredibly limited, so there aren't many sources to help keep the memory alive. Perhaps if more people knew about the Taiping, then it would grant those victims a new life. It might not be the new life they were hoping for when they first set foot on the ill-fated steamer, but the best we can do all these years later. If you know any more details on this disaster, please let us know in the comments. Share a like if you support remembrance of maritime tragedies, and consider sharing this with someone who is a fan of history. Don't forget to subscribe to get our next video. Thanks for watching.